Have you ever felt the weight of being in a place that was once your home, but where you're now treated like a nuisance? I did, and it wasn't a stranger, it wasn't a neighbor, it was my own grandson. He looked me in the eye and told me I couldn't eat right then because it would mess up the kitchen. Can you imagine hearing that from someone you've rocked, fed, and cared for when they had a fever? Stay with me until the end, because you'll understand how I realized it in time to protect myself and what I decided to do in that moment. The air felt heavier, as if each of his words had fallen on me like a cold stone. I looked into the same kitchen where, years before, I'd spent hours preparing Sunday dinner for the whole family. Now, it was silent, impeccably clean, and suddenly strange. I was no longer part of that scene. Have you ever been there? Being in the midst of your own family, but feeling invisible. It's like the whole life you've built has become irrelevant. I sat there, hands in my lap, listening to the sound of silverware hitting plates, and none of it was for me. The feeling of humiliation was so overwhelming that for a few seconds I thought I might faint, but I didn't cry. I didn't give them the pleasure of seeing my tears. Instead, I kept quiet. Inside, a part of me burned with sadness, but another was beginning to awaken, a part they didn't know, because they'd always seen only the sweet, patient, and helpful grandmother. What they didn't know is that, before being a grandmother, I was a woman who built everything from scratch. I knew how to survive. As they ate and laughed, I remembered all the times I'd put their well-being above my own. The silent sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the dreams I'd put aside to ensure they had what they needed. And, ironically, now I was being treated like dead weight. And that's when, for the first time in a long time, I let the humiliation transform into something else. A small but steady flame began to grow inside me. I knew I had to wait, pretend to be resigned, and, at the same time, think about what to do, because if there was one thing they hadn't learned yet, it was that no one knows the strength of a grandmother until she's provoked. As I watched their every gesture, every careless word, my mind worked silently. I knew that the spotless kitchen they so desperately wanted to keep clean only existed because of me. They'd simply forgotten, and I wouldn't remind them with words, but with actions. For the next few days, I maintained the same silence. I continued, looking out the window, sewing my clothes, making small notes in an old notebook. Sometimes Ryan, my grandson, would pass by me and barely notice I was there, but I saw everything. I mentally noted every action, every look, and, little by little, what had been sadness became strategy. You'll understand how, step by step, I turned that humiliation into the greatest lesson they've ever received. But first, I need to tell you what happened that morning, when they finally realized I wasn't the fragile woman they'd imagined. And perhaps, as you listened to me tell this, some memory also came to mind. It might have been a phrase spoken in a moment of indifference, a look that made you feel small in your own home, or that feeling that, no matter how much you've done, no one recognizes it. If anything in this story has ever revolted you, leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and knowing that I'm not alone and that other people have similar stories makes all the difference when you comment, like, and subscribe. It's not just a button you press. It's like saying, I believe this message needs to be heard. And that's what makes this channel grow and reach more people who may be going through something similar today, feeling invisible like I did that day. So, if this content spoke to you in any way, please like and subscribe to continue following stories like this. This is how we build a community where every voice matters, where every experience is valuable. And while you do that, I want you to stay with me, because what came after that morning was the turning point they never expected. As morning wore on and the sun began to stream through the window, I sat in the armchair by the door, sewing a worn piece of cloth I'd kept for years. The stitches were slow but firm, almost as if each needle prick were a thread connecting my present to the past. Ahead of me, the room seemed too silent, but in my head was a whirlwind of memories. They saw me there, glasses perched on the bridge of my nose, an old coat draped over my shoulders, hands trembling, and imagined that was all. Just a tired woman, waiting for the day to end. What they didn't know is that every wrinkle on my face carried decisions that changed destinies, hidden truths I'd never needed to tell, and a strength they hadn't yet seen. In the corner of the bookshelf, a wooden box held a handful of yellowed photographs. Sometimes, when no one was around, I'd open them and relive each image. There I was, at 28, cutting the ribbon on the first branch of the food company I'd founded from scratch. Another picture showed a garden party at my old house, tables full, music blaring, friends and relatives whose whereabouts I no longer remember. Back then, everything seemed solid, as if nothing could be taken from me. But life has a strange way of turning us inside out, of testing our mindset when we least expect it. As I sewed, I heard distant voices coming from the kitchen, laughter, dishes clanging, the clinking of glasses. That kitchen which they now defended as their exclusive territory was, in essence, an invisible monument to my efforts. Every tile, every cabinet, every appliance had a story. I remembered the day I carried the first refrigerator into the house alone, after saving for months to buy it. I remembered the smell of bread baking, the conversations around the table, the important decisions made there. And now, seeing all of this treated as if I had never been a part of it was like watching someone tear out an entire chapter of my life. But humiliation, though painful, has the power to ignite a spark. And I knew that to change that situation, it wasn't enough to react impulsively. I needed strategy. I needed observation. It was a silent but calculated journey. It wasn't just about regaining respect. It was about restoring truth. About showing that the impact of a lifetime isn't erased because someone chooses to forget. There was something curious about staying still. Silence allowed me to see behind the scenes of every gesture, every expression. The way Ryan looked away when he passed me. The way they discussed household decisions without even including me. Small signs that, to the uninitiated, would go unnoticed. But I collected each one, like putting together pieces of a larger puzzle. Time seemed to move more slowly these days. I divided my hours between sewing, reading an old book, and making discreet notes in my blue-covered notebook. It wasn't just a diary, it was a record of everything that might one day become evidence. I was aware that the transformation I sought wouldn't come from a moment of fury, but from a single, sure move. And while I maintained this seemingly calm routine, my mind revisited memories that reinforced who I truly was. The tough negotiations to keep my company open, the times I paid salaries even though I had no money for myself, the late nights spent managing contracts and clients. None of this was apparent to them now, but it was within me, ingrained, ready to emerge when the time came. That was the part they never understood. I wasn't fragile, I was just silent, and silence, if used well, is more powerful than any scream. It creates space for the other person to reveal more than they'd like, to feel safe enough to let their guard down. And that's exactly what happened in the days that followed. The conversations around me began to carry small contradictions. Comments about the electricity bill, about purchases that weren't being made, veiled complaints about things disappearing or not working properly. Nothing that could be directly attributed to me, yet. But I already knew where all this was leading. Maybe you've experienced something like this yourself. That moment when everyone thinks they're in control, without realizing that, in fact, every step they take is leading to the revelation you've been preparing. If you felt this way, write just one word in the comments. Wait. I was sitting in the armchair in the corner of the room, and I could hear every sound coming from the kitchen. The clinking of silverware against plates, the muffled laughter, the sound of the juice jug being placed on the table. It was a family dinner, but I wasn't part of it. From my position, I could only glimpse the faces illuminated by the yellow kitchen light, while I remained in the shadows of the living room, without a plate, without an invitation, without space. It was like watching my own story from the outside, as if I were a stranger in the house I helped build. It was then that I heard the phrase, spoken in an almost casual tone, but it cut deeper than any shout. "You're nothing but trouble." Coming from Ryan's mouth, it sounded like a sentence. He didn't even look at me when he said it. He was busy buttering his bread, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just torn away the last layer of respect remaining between us. For a few seconds, I stood still, feeling the weight of those words settle over me. I immediately remembered a rainy night years ago, when he was still small and woke up with a high fever. I'd spent the night beside him, holding his hand, applying cool cloths to his forehead, and praying for the fever to break. Another memory came soon after, me, kneeling on the floor, scrubbing stains from the carpet while he played on the couch with a toy car I'd bought myself with the little bit of my salary left that month. Those images, so vivid in my memory, meant nothing to him now. The pain was real, but there was something more happening inside me. I felt a silent transformation, almost imperceptible to anyone looking from the outside. That sentence had lit a new flame. It wasn't pure anger, it wasn't just hurt, it was a call to change my mindset, to rethink the role I was playing in that house. I no longer wanted to be just a spectator in my own story. As they continued their dinner, I remained quiet, not out of submission, but by choice. I knew there was more power in my silence than in any hasty response. Silence gave me time to observe, to understand the dynamics, to see the hidden truth behind each gesture. I could sense the discomfort when someone mentioned money, or the tension in conversations about overdue bills. These details, for most, would go unnoticed, but for me they were clues, signs that something was about to change. The journey unfolding before me wouldn't be one of direct confrontation. It would require patience, calculated decisions, and, above all, the ability to hide my intentions. It was as if I were backstage at a play, preparing for the right moment to enter the stage. Every memory, every hurt, every humiliation I'd suffered was being stored away, not as weight, but as fuel. In that moment, as I watched Ryan serve himself for the second time, I realized something important. They didn't really know me. They only knew the convenient version of me, the one who always said yes, who adapted, who accepted. But there was a part of me that had never left the scene, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself, and that moment was approaching. I thought about my decades of work, the tough negotiations I'd faced, the decisions that had changed the course of my life. This was my invisible heritage, something no one could take away. I had weathered storms, far greater than a cruel comment, but every storm leaves its mark on. My marks would now become my strength. And so, as the soft, melancholic music played in the background, I knew that the evening's story wouldn't end there. There was still much to be said, and it wouldn't be with words. What was to come would carry the impact of years of silence and hidden revelations. If you've ever had a moment where a sentence completely changed the way you saw yourself in a story, write the word "I woke up" in the comments. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, with only the dim light of a lamp on. I stared into space, but inside, a storm was brewing. It wasn't a noisy storm, made of screams or tears. It was silent, calculated, like that of someone who understands that the best response doesn't come at the moment of the offense, but at the right moment, when the other person least expects it. I already knew I couldn't change the past, but I could shape the future. And this time, I would be the author of every detail of this story. I remembered all the times when giving up something for them seemed like the most natural decision, as if my role was simply to serve, provide, sustain, always be available. But now, looking from the outside, I realized that this constant giving had created a dangerous habit. They believed I was inexhaustible. The hidden truth is that when people get used to receiving effortlessly, they stop recognizing the value of what they receive. And that was exactly what had happened there. As I sat motionless in my chair, I began to realize that the phrase uttered, "At the table you're nothing but trouble," wasn't just a thoughtless comment. It was a reflection of how they saw me, of how, little by little, they had placed me in an invisible box where I was nothing more than a burden to be carried. But my journey there taught me that other people's perceptions aren't a sentence. I had the power to rewrite the plot, to make choices that would change the course of this story. It was at that moment that something inside me clicked. There was no longer room for regret or waiting for external recognition. What I would do from then on would be a silent but profoundly impactful shift. I thought about every possession, every object, every detail of that house that bore my mark. I thought about how much these things had become part of their routine, as if they had appeared out of nowhere, and I realized that their absence would be far more revealing than any speech. The decision took shape, like a chess piece moved with precision. I knew I couldn't rush. I needed to act at the right time, so there would be no turning back. This wouldn't be an angry reaction, but a strategic move. The difference was that this time, I wasn't just trying to defend myself. I was creating a scenario where they would have to deal with the real consequences of their own choices. And to do so, each step had to be as discreet as it was firm. As the house slept, I closed my eyes for a moment and imagined their expressions as they realized something had changed. It wouldn't be an explosive gesture. There wouldn't be screams or slamming doors. It would be simple, almost imperceptible at first, but as the hours passed, it would become impossible to ignore. And when that moment came, they would understand perhaps, too late, that what they took for granted depended, from the beginning, on me. It was curious to see how silence strengthened me. Previously, I would have tried to explain, justify, and show in every way that I was still useful. But now, I understood that true strength lies in the ability to act without needing to announce it. This was the kind of transformation that would not only change my position in history but reveal to them a side of me they had never seen. The clock on the wall seemed to tick differently, as if each tick was confirmation that I was on the right path. I pulled my shawl around my shoulders, not because of the cold, but because of the comfort it brought me. It was the same one I'd worn to one of the most important meetings of my life, when I closed a deal that saved my company from bankruptcy. And in that moment, I realized I was about to do something just as decisive. I stood there, listening to the distant sound of the wind against the windows. Every minute that passed was another step toward something that would change the balance of that house forever. I was in no rush. Patience would be my ally, because when the action finally happened, the impact would be far greater than any immediate confrontation. If you've ever had a moment where you silently decided to completely change the way you participated in a story, write the word "changed" in the comments. I slowly opened the antique closet in the corner of the room, the one everyone thought was filled only with old clothes and dusty mementos. The hinges creaked, betraying the movement, but I didn't care. Behind a stack of faded towels, I found the brown folder I'd kept for decades. It was there that part of my story lay, recorded on pages yellowed with age. I pulled out the receipt from the refrigerator, the payment receipts, the deed to a small property. Each document I held was like a piece of a puzzle that would soon be complete. As I leafed through those pages, I felt a mixture of pride and indignation. Pride, remembering every battle won to acquire what was there. Indignation, knowing that, in their eyes, all of this was nothing more than ownerless things, available to be used until they wore out. The hidden truth is that nothing in life just appears. Behind every object are journeys, choices, sleepless nights, and costly decisions. And that was the part they never saw, because I never needed to show it. I grabbed my bag, carefully placed my documents inside, and closed the locker. There was something liberating in that gesture, as if I were preparing not just an action, but an entire chapter that would change the narrative. I spent the rest of the afternoon in silence, busy with small tasks, but with my mind focused on what would happen the next morning. I couldn't afford to miss the timing. A move too early could be wasted, too late, and it would lose its impact. At the end of the day, I knocked on Maggie's door, my neighbor and longtime friend. She greeted me with a smile, but upon seeing my expression, she frowned. "What's wrong?" she asked. I accepted the coffee she offered me, and as the steam rose from the cup, I leaned over and whispered in her ear, "Don't say anything, but I'll come get it tomorrow morning." She didn't ask any questions, just nodded, as if she understood that there are times when words can do more harm than good. I returned home before anyone noticed my absence. On the way, I reflected on the delicacy of the plan. It wasn't just about taking what was mine, it was about the impact of doing it precisely, so that the message would be clear without me having to utter a single accusation. That was the power of acting strategically, letting the act itself be the revelation. As I prepared INP, my mind revisited the behind-the-scenes decisions that had led me to this point. I remembered the day I bought that refrigerator, saving every penny and postponing other needs. I remembered carrying the weight of the appliance to the kitchen alone, how it became the center of meals and conversations, how it stored not only food, but also moments. Now, its mere absence would be louder than any scream. The night wore on, and the house was silent. I walked to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. I felt butterflies in my stomach, not from fear, but from the anticipation that precedes a major move. I knew that, at dawn, I would take a step of no return. And, deep down, this was the most liberating part of the entire journey, realizing that when you decide to act, hesitation gives way and confidence takes its place. I pulled the blanket over me, closed my eyes, and let my breathing come. Every detail was in place, and what would come next would be the silent answer to years of invisibility. If you've ever prepared for a moment when you knew nothing would be the same again, leave the word ready in the comments. The sun had barely risen above the horizon when I heard the sound of the engine approaching, a steady, constant roar that clashed with the gentle silence of the morning. I pulled back the curtain and saw the truck parked right in front of the house. The air still carried the freshness of dawn, and the golden light was beginning to trace soft contours on the walls and garden. I put on my apron, not like someone about to make coffee, but like a kind of armor. There was no tremor in my hands, no hesitation in my eyes. I knew exactly what was going to happen, and was ready for every detail. The two men stepped out of the truck with determined steps, greeting me with a respectful nod. I opened the door and, without raising my voice, pointed to the kitchen. "That's it," I said, and they followed my instructions without question. The metallic clang of hooks, the scrape of shoes against the floor, the squeak of the transport cart's wheels-itch sound seemed to mark the beginning of a new stage in my journey. It was almost like hearing destiny itself being set in motion, as I watched the refrigerator being carefully moved. A flood of memories flooded through me. I saw in my mind the young hands that had once signed the check to buy it, the first purchases I'd stored there, the family dinners, the desserts prepared for celebrations. All of this, which had become commonplace to them, carried pieces of my history, my work, my dedication. And now, every inch it moved away from the walls seemed to give me back the control I'd surrendered for years. The sound of quick footsteps in the hallway broke the moment. Ryan appeared, his hair still disheveled and his expression confused. "What's happening?" he shouted, his voice cracking between anger and disbelief. For a moment, I saw the boy I'd once rushed to help, whom I'd comforted on feverish nights, whom I'd cradled in my arms. But that image quickly dissipated before the man who now looked at me as if I were the intruder. I turned to him, standing straight, and replied calmly, but with the firmness of someone who no longer needed to justify anything. "I'm taking what's mine. After all, I was the one who caused the trouble here." The words came out clearly, cutting through the air like a thin blade. There was no shouting, no irony, just the certainty that I was giving him back the same measure with which I had been treated. Ryan stood there, his reaction unresponsive. It was as if he were trying to process not just the scene before his eyes, but the entire hidden truth behind it. And as the men finished loading the refrigerator, I realized that this moment wasn't about the object itself. It was about mindset, about the quiet transformation that happens when someone finally understands their own worth. The truck was locked, and the first handed the documents to the driver, confirming the destination I had already agreed upon. At the gate, I took a deep breath and felt the weight of the past few years begin to lift. There was no room for regret. That unexpected action was the symbol of a new phase, not meant to hurt, but to demonstrate. As the engine pulled away and the sound faded down the street, I looked back and saw Ryan still standing there, caught between wounded pride and surprise. The kitchen, now with an empty space in the corner, seemed to echo more than any words. This emptiness was deliberate, calculated, and I knew it would speak for me in the hours to come. And I, standing outside, felt that silence said more than any speech could. It was my answer, simple and definitive. If you've ever experienced a moment where the silence of your actions spoke louder than any explanation, write the word "I understand" in the comments. I stood there for a few moments, observing that empty space in the kitchen. It wasn't just the physical absence of the refrigerator that hung heavy in the air, but the symbolic absence of everything it represented. It was as if someone had finally turned the page of a book that had been open to the same sentence for years. Perhaps, to outsiders, it was just an appliance being taken away. But to me, it was a message, and it's curious how certain moments make us revisit our own stories. Perhaps you, listening now, have experienced something similar, a situation where what seemed small to you meant a lot. If something in this story has ever revolted you, leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, because that's where this conversation truly comes to life. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content. When you comment, like, and subscribe, it's not just a click. It's like you're saying, "This story matters. This message needs to be heard." And that gives us the strength to continue bringing narratives that, in some way, touch, awaken, and even transform. So, if this scene resonated with you, like the video and subscribe so you don't miss future stories. This is how we build a space where every voice counts, where experiences converge and form something greater. As I thought about this, I glanced back at the open door, feeling the cool morning air drift into the kitchen. There was still much to come that day. as the truck pulled away and silence fell. Maggie stood on the sidewalk, watching me with a look that mixed surprise and respect. Later, she told me that for years, she had never imagined how much of that house had passed through my hands before arriving here. "That's when we found out," she said, almost reverently, "that refrigerator and half the furniture were hers, bought with her life's work." These words echoed within me, not as a compliment, but as confirmation of something that had always been hidden beneath the dust of time. People see the present, but rarely wonder about the roots of things, about the silent journey that builds each achievement. And in that kitchen, with the emptiness still fresh in the corner, this hidden truth began to surface almost palpably, as if the air carried the story no one wanted to hear. I remember the day I bought that refrigerator. It was summer, and the air felt thick and heavy. I had saved for months, cutting out small luxuries, choosing the necessary over the superfluous. I worked from morning to night at the small food company I had founded, delivering lunchboxes, organizing events, cooking with the haste and precision of someone who couldn't afford to make mistakes. The day I went to the store, I carried with me not just the money, but the weight of years of effort. I signed a check with a mixture of exhaustion and pride, feeling as if that appliance were an extension of my own history, a silent symbol of independence. Behind the scenes of my life, there were no sudden miracles. Everything was built with firm, often solitary decisions, and a mindset that taught me to waste nothing, neither time nor opportunities. The refrigerator, the living room cabinet, even the dining table, each piece had a memory etched into it. An interrupted conversation, a special meal, an unexpected hug. And seeing all of this treated as if it had simply appeared there has always been one of the greatest silent insults I've learned to endure. But there's something curious about justice. It doesn't always arrive loudly. Often, it presents itself, almost discreetly, like a whisper that only those who need to hear it can hear. My action that morning wasn't intended to humiliate anyone, but to restore the true weight of things, to show that behind every object lies a journey, a sacrifice, and, above all, a story of belonging. That, as Maggie spoke, I could tell she was also reflecting on her own life. Perhaps she reviewed choices, remembered things she'd done for others without receiving recognition. The impact of a gesture goes beyond the one who performs it. It reverberates in those around her, awakening memories and even encouraging silent transformations. The flashback of me, younger, signing that check, came and went like an old movie. I saw the pen gliding across the paper, felt the sweat on my hands, and at the same time, I heard myself thinking, this will be worth it. And it was. Not just for its usefulness, but for its symbol. It was a mark of autonomy, of capacity, of decision-making, and it was precisely this symbol that I decided to reclaim that day, not for myself, but to make it clear to everyone that nothing is truly valued until it's lost. At that moment, I realized that what was happening wasn't just about furniture or appliances. It was about something much bigger, respect. And respect isn't asked for, it's imposed through actions. Divine justice isn't revenge. It's simply balance returning to its proper place at the exact time it needs to return. If you've ever felt that something or someone only recognized your value when you were no longer there, write the word value in the comments. The next day started differently for them. Ryan woke up later than usual, his hair still messy and his face puffy from sleep. He dragged himself to the kitchen, as he did every day, but something made him stop at the door. The corner, where the refrigerator once stood, was now just an empty rectangle on the floor, a silent space that seemed to scream. He stood there for a few seconds, staring, as if still hoping that, in the blink of an eye, everything would return to the way it was before, but it didn't. He decided to make himself some coffee, trying to ignore the growing discomfort. He opened the cupboards for milk, and only then realized there was no milk, nothing fresh. The eggs that were usually on hand, the always cold butter, the fruit, everything had disappeared, along with what he'd considered mere objects. He looked at the counter and began to realize the practical dimension of the absence. The coffee might have been made, but without the usual warm bread and butter. Without the familiar smell that filled the morning, everything felt incomplete as he scrambled around the kitchen, trying to improvise. The rest of the family began to appear. First, Maggie, with a weary expression, then the others, one by one, all driven by the same routine of years. But when they encountered the emptiness and disorganization scattered across the table, the mood changed. Small arguments began. Who would buy food, where to store the produce, how to keep things fresh without a proper place. The artificial harmony that had previously masked contempt gave way to silent chaos, interrupted only by the sound of overlapping voices. Ryan tried to maintain control, but his impatience grew. The night before, he had still believed he could handle the situation simply, that the absence of the refrigerator would be nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. But as the hours passed, he realized the impact was far greater than he had imagined. It wasn't just about storing food, it was about the invisible order its presence brought, the quiet security of knowing there was always something there, ready to be used. Maggie, who had been watching from afar, said nothing, but there was a deep understanding in her eyes. She knew that what was happening wasn't just a practical hardship, it was a lesson that arrived quietly, but with force. The family was beginning to realize that the value of the things they despised lay not in the price paid, but in the constancy with which they sustained daily life. And that constancy, now, was gone. The house felt smaller, more cramped, as if absence had pushed everyone closer together, forcing them to face truths they'd avoided. Small habits began to unravel, the coffee growing cold in the cup, the bread bought in a hurry, conversations interrupted by arguments over who would solve what. It was as if, suddenly, everyone was living without a safety net that had always been there and that they only now realized existed. There were no cries of regret, no dramatic declarations. But there was something in the air, a different weight. Ryan, in particular, seemed to carry this weight on his shoulders, as if every movement in the kitchen was a silent reminder of the decision that had triggered it all. It was the moral downfall that isn't made public, but that corrodes from within. He wouldn't look directly at anyone, as if afraid to find confirmation in their eyes that he had failed. Meanwhile, outside, life went on, but inside that house, something fundamental had changed. The emptiness in the corner of the kitchen was no longer just physical, it was symbolic. And with each passing day, this symbol seemed to grow stronger, reminding them that some losses are irreversible, especially when what was lost wasn't just a thing, but the meaning behind it. If you've ever seen someone learn the value of something only when it was too late, write the word late in the comments. In the new house, everything seemed smaller, yet lighter at the same time. The white walls reflected the soft morning light, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the room, creating a welcoming feeling that contrasted with the coldness of the previous house. Maggie sat across from me, her hands wrapped around the warm cup, and for the first time in a long time, our conversations were unhurried. It was as if time had slowed down, allowing every detail to be felt, as if every minute held more value. Now, I looked around and realized I didn't need much to live. A cupboard with the essentials, a small table for two, a worn but comfortable sofa. Everything had its place and purpose. There was no unnecessary noise, no raised voices, no constant burden of needing to prove my worth. However, as I lifted the cup to my lips, a thought swept through me like a cold wind. I've gained my peace, but I've lost my family. It wasn't a phrase spoken with anger or regret, but with the clear awareness that some choices, no matter how correct, carry a cost. And in that moment, I felt that cost vividly. The image of the kitchen from before, with its constant movement of footsteps, voices, and tasks, was still vivid in my memory. But now, all of that was just a distant memory, like an old photograph tucked away in the back of a drawer. Maggie, perhaps sensing my prolonged silence, tried to change the subject, talking about the decorations that were still missing, or the small garden we could tend together. I smiled, but inside I was reliving every moment that had brought me there. I didn't regret the decision I'd made, because it was the fruit of a mindset shaped by years of struggle and resilience. But at the same time, the hidden truth I avoided facing was that, on some level, I still wished there had been another way. As the conversation continued, my mind wandered. How many times, along the way, do we have to give up something to preserve something else? How many decisions do we make without knowing the impact they will have on our relationships? And, perhaps the most difficult question, is the peace we seek always worth the price we pay? Looking out the window, I saw the leaves slowly falling in the yard, and I realized there was a quiet beauty in embracing change. Not all stories have triumphant endings. Some end on softer notes, with scars that no longer hurt but remain as reminders. I knew that house represented more than a fresh start. It represented the freedom to be who I am, without being measured by how much I can serve or please others. yet their absence still echoed in the small details. The morning silence, which once felt like peace, sometimes felt like emptiness. The coffee for two, which brought me comfort, also reminded me of the crowded tables I once knew. It was a strange mix of relief and melancholy, as if life were telling me that not all victories come without loss. Maggie touched my hand, and in her eyes there was a silent understanding. There was no need to say anything. There were things you only understand when you live them. And perhaps this was the greatest impact of my entire journey, realizing that, even with all the revelations, transformations, and decisions made, there is still a space within us that holds what is gone. And, in a way, this space is also a reminder that love and longing can coexist, side by side, without one canceling the other out. If you've ever experienced something that gave you freedom, but left a mark of longing, write the words. In the comments, the camera seemed to capture more than just my expression. It was as if the silence around me amplified every detail of my face, the wrinkles marked by time, but also by patience, the look that, despite being tired, still held firm, and the slow breathing, as if choosing each word carefully. I knew that what I was about to say wasn't just a catchphrase, it was a truth distilled from years of experience, observation, and, above all, the pain of being invisible. When the words came out, they weren't filled with anger, but with certainty. The bread you deny will one day make you hungry. It wasn't just any warning. It was a sentence life exacts sooner or later. And deep down, I knew this wasn't a lesson just for those who had hurt me. It was for anyone who, out of pride or carelessness, believes they can dismiss the value of something or someone and not face the consequences. As I said this, I wasn't looking at anyone in particular, but the message seemed to pierce the air and find its destination. The phrase echoed within me, and I knew it didn't come from this story alone, but from so many others that accumulate within us, like chapters in a book that never closes. I didn't need to raise my voice. The strength lay in the calmness with which I spoke, in the clarity of my meaning, in the weight of each syllable that carried memories and truths that never fade. I remembered moments gone by, gestures of generosity that were ignored, efforts that were never recognized. It wasn't about food. It never was. It was about respect, about the understanding that certain presences sustain more than meets the eye. This was the hidden truth that many don't realize until it's too late. This invisible absence, when it sets in, changes everything around it like a silent gear that stops and leaves the entire system without direction. On the other side, I noticed eyes shifting. Maybe it was discomfort. Maybe it was embarrassment. Maybe it was the beginning of an internal transformation. The kind that doesn't announce itself but begins to silently stir the minds of those listening. This is the true impact of words. When they're born from experience, they don't need applause, because their function isn't to please, but to make us think. And when thought is profound, it opens paths to decisions that previously seemed impossible. In that moment, I felt a peace unlike the one I'd found in my new home. It was the peace of having said what needed to be said, of having returned the favor, not in revenge, but in truth, of having used my voice, so often silenced, to plant a seed. Maybe it would grow, maybe not. But I knew that from now on, silence would no longer be synonymous with submission. It would mean choice. The room remained quiet, as if the walls had also absorbed those words. I remained still, looking ahead, in no rush to move. Sometimes the greatest strength lies in remaining, in holding one's gaze, in not backing down from what needs to be faced. Life has its behind-the-scenes moments, and I've learned that many victories don't happen in front of audiences, but in discreet corners, away from the spotlight. When we choose not to give in to what diminishes us, it's in this intimate space, away from the rush, that true transformation happens. And there, in that moment, I realized that every gesture I made, every decision I made, was part of something bigger. It wasn't just about reclaiming a refrigerator or reclaiming what was mine. It was about writing, with actions and words, a story where my voice carried weight, a story that, even without asking, would leave lessons. It was about showing, to anyone who wanted to see, that there is a kind of power that doesn't scream, but transforms in, that this power lives within those who refuse to be erased. If you've ever said something that completely changed the way someone looked at you, write the word truth in the comments. If you've made it this far with me, it's because this story somehow spoke to you. So, before you leave, Subscribe to the channel, that way you won't miss the next stories that bring lessons that life teaches in silence. Also, leave your comment writing, "Respect never gets old." I want to see how many of us still believe that gratitude is something we practice every day. Oh, and leave a like, because that's how I know this conversation resonated with you. There's a video here that complements this topic. Click it and stay with me there.